This is an exceptionally intense and visceral script. Here is the paraphrase, carefully shifting the word order while preserving the same high-stakes, dramatic, and articulate style. The Goler clan, America's most shameful secret. In the mountains of North Georgia, there is a place where the family tree doesn't branch out. Instead, it loops back on itself like a noose. It's a place where children are born with their grandfather's eyes and the twisted spine of their aunt, because the grandfather and the aunt are, in fact, the very same person. For 7 generations, human beings have been trapped here in a genetic prison of their own making. Each birth there was like a roll of the dice, and those dice were utterly loaded against hope itself. The locals refuse to speak its name. They will tell you about hauntings, about cursed land, about bumps in the night. But they will never tell you about the hollow where cousins became parents and where parents became monsters. They will not speak of the children who never learned to talk properly because their tongues were too thick, their palates too clefted, their minds too fractured by the weight of their poisoned blood. But tonight, we will go there anyway. Tonight, we are walking into the heart of America's most shameful family secret. A place where love was twisted into perversion, where survival became sin, and where the very concept of family was warped into something that would make the devil himself look away in disgust. This is the story of the Goler clan. And if you think you already know what human depravity looks like, you are about to learn that you were profoundly wrong. The descent of Josiah Goler. The mountain hollow sits like a wound in the earth, 30 miles from the nearest paved road, concealed behind ridges that appear to fold in on themselves like protecting arms. No GPS will guide you there. No map shows its actual location. And the few who did find it now wish they had not. Because in this place, isolated from all civilization for close to 2 centuries, one family made choices that would reverberate through the generations like screams echoing in a canyon, growing louder, more distorted, and more horrific with every passing year. It began in 1847 with a man named Josiah Goler, a name that would ultimately become synonymous with human degradation. Josiah wasn't an evil man when he first carved his homestead out of the Georgia wilderness. He was simply desperate. A widower with 3 young children, fleeing shame and debts from a failed farm in South Carolina, he sought sanctuary in the mountains where no law could reach him and no judgment could find him. But isolation has a powerful way of changing people, of warping their minds much like heat warps metal. And Josiah Goler was about to discover just how far from God's light a man could fall when there was no one watching, no one to stop him, and no one to say no. The setting of the pattern. The first winter came close to killing all of them. Food ran out in December. The closest settlement was a 3-day walk through snow that could easily bury a man alive. Josiah's children were starving. It was then that he made a choice that would permanently damn his bloodline for all generations to come. He looked at his eldest daughter, Sarah, who was barely 16, and saw not a child, but a solution. A way to keep his family alive. A way to ensure his legacy would continue, regardless of the cost. What transpired next in that cramped, freezing cabin would set in motion a cycle of abuse so systematic and so generational that the Goler name would be whispered in the same breath as biblical curses. Sarah bore her father's first child 9 months later, a boy with eyes set too close together and a cry that was more animalistic than human. They named him Abel. And Abel would grow up to believe that what happened to his mother was perfectly normal, that sisters were intended for breeding, and that family love held a very different meaning in the Goler Hollow than it did in the outside world. By the time Abel was 15, he had already fathered 2 children with his own sister, and the pattern was set in stone, carved into the genetic code of every Goler who would follow. The genetic nightmare begins. By 1880, the Hollow had become a genetic nightmare that defied all comprehension. 3 generations of Golers now lived in ramshackle cabins scattered across the valley floor like tumors on diseased flesh. Children who were simultaneously cousins, siblings, and half-siblings wandered the compound with vacant stares and twisted limbs. The family tree had turned into a family wreath, a closed circle of poison flowing through veins that should never have carried the same blood twice. The women bore children as reliably as the seasons changed, not out of choice, not out of love, but out of something far darker, a biological imperative twisted by years of abuse into something utterly unrecognizable. Mothers who were also sisters, daughters who became wives, and aunts who were also grandmothers to their own children's children. The very words for family relationships began to lose all meaning in the Goler hollow, and the children they produced grew stranger with each passing generation. Some were born with extra fingers fused together like melted wax. Others entered the world with hearts that beat irregularly, lungs that couldn't quite fill, and minds that would never develop past the capacity of a 5-year-old. The lucky ones died young. The unlucky ones lived to perpetuate the cycle. The accumulation of sin. But it wasn't just the physical deformities that made the Goler children different. It was something deeper, something residing behind their eyes, a kind of emptiness that spoke of souls damaged before they ever drew a breath. They communicated with grunts and gestures more than actual words. They fought over scraps like animals, and when they reached puberty, they turned to the only partners they had ever known, each other. The outside world remained blissfully unaware. Occasionally, a hunter or a government surveyor would accidentally stumble across the edge of Goler territory, but they never stayed long. There was simply something about the place that made your skin crawl, made your teeth ache, made you want to run back to civilization and scrub yourself clean. Most people dismissed it as superstition, as the natural unease that comes from being alone in the deep wilderness. They never imagined they were sensing the psychic weight of 7 decades of accumulated sin. The 4th generation brought horrors that would have made Dante himself weep. By 1910, children were being born who shared genetic material with so many relatives that their DNA looked like a spider's web of decay and repetition. Some emerged from the womb already dying, their organs incorrectly formed, their bones twisted into impossible shapes. Others lived, but existed in a twilight state between human and something else entirely. Grotesque persistence. There was Mary Goler, born in 1912, who never learned to walk upright because her spine curved like a question mark. She spent her life crawling on all fours, snarling and grunting at anyone who came near. At 14, she gave birth to twins, fathered by her own grandfather. One was stillborn. The other lived for 3 agonizing days, its heart starting and stopping like a broken clock until mercy finally claimed it. Then there was Thomas Goler, born with eyes on opposite sides of his head like a fish, who could never look at anything straight on. The family kept him chained in a root cellar because he had developed an appetite for things that shouldn't be eaten, bark, stones, and the flesh of smaller children when no one was watching. He lived to be 37, a grotesque testament to the family's refusal to allow nature to take its course. But perhaps most disturbing was the emergence of what the family began calling the silent ones, children born without the capacity to make sound, who communicated solely through a primitive sign language of scratching and pointing that resembled nothing so much as the markings left by dying animals. These children seemed to understand that their very existence was wrong, that they were living violations of natural law. The breeding program. The patriarch of this generation was Ezekiel Goler, great-grandson of the original Josiah, who had taken it upon himself to meticulously document the family's breeding program in a leather-bound journal written in his own blood. Page after page held genealogical charts that looked more like disease vectors than family trees, tracking which combinations produced the strongest children, which pairings resulted in early death, and which genetic cocktails created the most useful deformities. He wrote about his daughters and nieces like a farmer discussing livestock, calculating their fertility cycles and planning their pregnancies like harvests to be optimized. By the 1940s, the 5th generation of Golers had become something that could barely be called human. The children born in this era were living proof that there are genetic lines that should never be crossed, boundaries that nature herself has written into the very fabric of life. When those boundaries are systematically and repeatedly violated for nearly a century, the results become something straight out of humanity's darkest nightmares. The family had swelled to over 60 members, all crammed into a collection of shacks and lean-tos that reeked of rotting flesh and human waste. Sanitation was non-existent. Medical care consisted of whatever folk remedies they could recall from generations past, most of which involved mixing bodily fluids in ways that would have horrified medieval plague doctors. Children regularly died from infections that basic antibiotics could have cured. But the outside world might as well have been another planet. The weight of impossibility. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? How far would you have gone to break a cycle that seemed utterly unstoppable? The fifth generation produced children who defied medical explanation. There was little Samuel Goler, born with organs arranged randomly throughout his torso, as if someone had assembled him by shaking a bag of spare parts. He lived for 6 months, sustained only by the stubborn refusal of his malformed heart to acknowledge that it should have stopped beating. His autopsy, performed by family members after his death, revealed a digestive system that looped back on itself 3 times and kidneys that had somehow grown together into a single, useless mass. Then there was the cluster of children born between 1943 and 1945 who entered the world sharing genetic material so similar they were essentially clones, but clones of a broken template. These children looked identical but thought differently, moved differently, and aged at different rates. One would remain the size of a toddler while his genetic twin grew to adult height. Another would develop the mental capacity of a college professor while trapped in a body that could not control its own bowel movements. But the most disturbing development in the fifth generation was the emergence of what can only be called collective consciousness among some of the children. Groups of siblings seemed to share thoughts, would speak in unison without planning, and appeared to feel each other's pain across physical distance. It was as if the genetic material had become so concentrated, so repeatedly recycled, that individual identity itself was beginning to break down. Exposure and aftermath. The end came not through disease or violence, but through something far more chilling: recognition. In 1962, a social worker named Margaret Caldwell was conducting a routine survey of remote mountain communities when she stumbled across what remained of the Goler clan. What she found would haunt her for the rest of her life and finally bring this generational nightmare into the light of day. Caldwell's field notes, preserved in the Georgia State Archives, read like dispatches from hell itself. She described children who moved in groups like flocks of broken birds, their malformed limbs creating shadows that didn't match their bodies. She wrote about adults who communicated in a pidgin language of grunts and gestures that bore no resemblance to English, who seemed to have entirely forgotten that a world existed beyond their poison valley. But it was the genealogical records that truly broke her mind. When Caldwell attempted to map a family tree to understand the relationships between the clan members, she discovered that every single person in the hollow was related to every other person in at least 4 different ways. Children who were simultaneously their own cousins and step-siblings, women who had given birth to their own genetic half-brothers, men who were both father and grandfather to the same child. The mathematical impossibility of it all, the sheer statistical improbability that human beings could survive this level of genetic damage, suggested that something beyond mere inbreeding was occurring in the Goler Hollow. Something that fundamentally challenged the very foundations of biological science. These were no longer just isolated people making desperate choices. This was an evolutionary dead end that had somehow learned to perpetuate itself, a genetic mutation feeding on its own impossibility. The price of survival. Caldwell's report triggered the largest social services intervention in Georgia's history. Over 40 family members were removed from the hollow and placed in state institutions, though most died within months of leaving their ancestral home. The few who survived the transition to civilization never truly adapted. They spoke of the hollow like prisoners speak of solitary confinement, as a place of unimaginable suffering that had, impossibly, become home, and that called to them even as it had destroyed them. The last known member of the Goler clan, a woman named Patience, who may have been anywhere from 20 to 50 years old based on her medical records, lived in a state mental facility until 1984. She spent her final decades drawing pictures on the walls of her room, crude family trees that spiraled inward like whirlpools, faces that all looked identical, children holding hands in circles that never opened. Today, the Goler Hollow sits empty, reclaimed by the Georgia wilderness, as if nature itself is attempting to erase what happened there. The shacks have collapsed into piles of rusted metal and rotting wood. The wells have been sealed. The graves, unmarked and unnumbered, holding the remains of children who lived and died without ever knowing another way to exist, are slowly disappearing beneath decades of fallen leaves. The unsettling legacy. But the land remembers. Hunters who venture too close to the old Goler territory speak of feeling watched by invisible eyes. They report finding arrangements of stones that form patterns too complex to be natural, too deliberate to be coincidental. They describe dreams of children with faces like broken mirrors, calling out in voices that sound like whine through dead trees. The scientific community has struggled to explain how the Goler family survived for so long. By every law of genetics and evolution, they should have died out within 3 generations. The level of inbreeding they maintained should have resulted in complete sterility and infant mortality rates approaching 100%. Yet, somehow, they persisted for over a century, producing children who lived just long enough to perpetuate the cycle before succumbing to the weight of their poisoned inheritance. Some researchers theorize that the family developed genetic mutations that allowed them to survive conditions that would kill normal human beings, adaptations that came at the cost of everything we recognize as humanity. Others suggest that isolation itself became a kind of evolutionary pressure, forcing rapid changes that created something new, something that existed in the spaces between human and not human. But perhaps the most disturbing theory is the simplest one, that the Goler clan represents what happens when human beings are stripped of everything except the primal drive to survive. When love is replaced by possession, when family becomes imprisonment, when the future is nothing more than an endless repetition of the past's worst mistakes. The enduring echo. The hollow remains off-limits to the public, officially designated an environmental hazard due to contaminated groundwater. But those who know the true history understand that the danger is not chemical. It is something far more fundamental. It is the chilling knowledge that human beings are capable of creating their own hell, of living in it for generations, and of calling it home. 7 generations of children born to cousins. 7 generations of human beings who never knew what they could have been. 7 generations of proof that some sins echo through bloodlines like curses, growing stronger with each repetition until they consume everything in their path. The Goler Hollow is empty now, but somewhere in the mountains of Georgia, the wind still carries whispers of names that should never have been spoken, of children who should never have been born, of a family that loved itself to death.